I still hear the sound of his laughter echoing in that restaurant, sharp and careless, slicing right through my chest like I wasn't even there. I had just handed my own son the keys to a $300,000 SUV for his 40th birthday, a gift that represented decades of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and everything I had built as a woman on my own, and he raised his glass, smirked, and said, "A toast to the woman who finally realized money can't buy love." Everyone laughed. Everyone except me. I sat there frozen, my smile cracking, my hands shaking under the table, wondering how the child I carried inside my body could humiliate me so easily in public. So, tell me honestly, before you judge anything else I say after this, was I wrong to feel something break inside me at that moment? And was I wrong for what I eventually decided to do? Let me rewind, because nothing about that moment makes sense unless you understand who I am and how I got there. I'm a woman who spent her entire adult life proving that I could stand on my own without a man rescuing me. I became a mother young, much younger than I planned, and my son's father walked out before my body had even fully healed from childbirth. I still remember standing in the doorway of our tiny apartment, holding a crying baby against my chest, watching the man I loved walk away with a suitcase and promises that evaporated before the door even closed. From that moment on, it was just me and my son against the world, and I made a promise to myself that he would never feel abandoned, never feel less than, never struggle the way I did. I worked jobs that drained the life out of me. I cleaned offices at night, answered phones during the day, and studied whenever I could keep my eyes open. I missed parties, friendships, relationships, and even parts of myself because every decision I made revolved around him. When he wanted piano lessons, I found a way. When he wanted to go to a better school, I took on more work. When he asked why his friends had dads at school events and he didn't, I swallowed my own pain and told him we were enough. And for a long time, I truly believed that. As he grew older, I noticed something shifting in him. He became ambitious, driven, but also distant in a way that scared me. He learned early that success meant power, and power meant safety. I can't blame him for that, because that's the world we live in, especially for women who raise sons alone. I encouraged his ambition because I thought it would protect him, because I thought if he never had to worry about money, he'd never feel the fear I felt every time rent was due or the fridge looked empty. My career took off in ways I never expected. Years of grinding finally turned into opportunities, and opportunities turned into serious money. Real money, the kind that changes how people look at you, especially when you're a woman who didn't inherit it, didn't marry into it, and didn't apologize for earning it. By the time my son was in his late 30s, I was financially secure in a way I once thought was impossible. And I did what mothers like me do best. I shared it with my child. I paid for his education. I helped him buy his first condo. I invested in his business ventures when banks wouldn't take him seriously yet. Every time he stumbled, I was there with a soft landing. Every time he succeeded, I cheered louder than anyone else. But somewhere along the way, my support stopped feeling like love to him and started feeling like something else, something colder, something transactional. I didn't see it clearly at the time, because mothers like me are very good at ignoring red flags when they involve our children. When his 40th birthday approached, I wanted to do something special. 40 felt monumental. I thought about everything he had overcome, everything we had survived together. I wanted a gift that symbolized not just wealth, but pride, stability, and legacy. I chose the SUV carefully, down to the custom interior, the color he once pointed out years ago when we passed a similar car on the street, and he joked that one day he'd own something like that. I remembered that moment. I remembered how his eyes lit up. So I bought it outright, no loans, no strings attached, because in my mind, that's what love looked like. The party was elegant, carefully planned, filled with his friends, his colleagues, his wife, and people who admired him. I stood there watching him move through the room so confidently, shaking hands, laughing, commanding attention, and I felt proud, genuinely proud. When it was time for the gift, I asked the staff to bring out the keys. I stood up, heart racing like I was the one turning 40, and made a short speech about how proud I was to be his mother, about resilience, about family, about how everything I did for him. That's when he raised his glass and said those words, that toast, that laugh, that moment when the room laughed with him and I felt completely alone. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was the realization that my love had been reduced to a punchline, that my sacrifices were invisible, that in his eyes I was no longer his mother, but a symbol of something he resented. After the party, he barely spoke to me. He hugged me quickly, thanked me in that polite, distant way people thank someone they don't want to owe anything to, and moved on to the next conversation. I drove home alone that night in silence, replaying everything over and over again, asking myself how we got here. I started noticing things I had brushed off before, the way he talked over me, the way he dismissed my advice, the way his wife looked at me like I was an inconvenience rather than family, the way my role in his life had quietly shrunk as his lifestyle expanded. I cried that night, not because of the money, not because of the SUV, but because I felt like I had failed as a mother in the one way that mattered most. I had given him everything except boundaries. I had taught him how to succeed, but not how to respect. And as a woman who spent her life fighting to be respected in a world that constantly tried to minimize me, that realization hurt more than I can put into words. This is where my story truly begins, because what happened after that night wasn't impulsive, and it wasn't petty. It was the result of years of being taken for granted, years of swallowing my feelings to keep the peace, years of telling myself that motherhood meant enduring anything as long as your child was happy. But happiness built on entitlement has a way of rotting from the inside, and I was about to learn just how deep that rot had gone. That's part one of my story, and I promise you, this is only the beginning. If you think this is just about a gift or a bad joke, you're nowhere near the truth yet. After that night, something inside me shifted permanently, even though I tried to pretend everything was normal. For weeks, I replayed his words in my head while doing the most ordinary things. Making coffee, answering emails, folding laundry. And each time it felt heavier, like the meaning kept sinking deeper. I realized I had spent 40 years being strong for everyone else and gentle with him. But I had never allowed myself to be honest about how lonely that role had made me. I was his mother, yes, but I was also a woman who had needs, pride, and limits, even if I'd ignored them for most of my life. I didn't confront him right away, that's important. I didn't call him angry or send a dramatic message. I did what women like me often do. I observed. I watched how he treated me afterward. Days turned into weeks, and the calls stopped coming. When I reached out, the conversations were rushed, distracted, like I was interrupting something more important. When I mentioned the party, even lightly, he brushed it off and said I was being sensitive. That word, sensitive, landed like an insult disguised as concern. I had heard it my entire life whenever I stood up for myself, and hearing it from my own son felt like betrayal. I started thinking back to moments I had excused over the years. The time he told me not to give advice because I didn't understand modern business. The time he laughed when I said I was tired and said, "What do you have to be tired about now?" as if my past labor had an expiration date. The way he spoke about women, sometimes, casually dismissive, as if empathy was a weakness. I wondered when he learned that, and the answer I hated most was that maybe he learned it from watching me accept too much. His wife complicated everything. From the beginning, I had tried to be welcoming, respectful, careful not to overstep. I knew the stereotypes about mothers. In-law, especially successful women who don't know how to shrink themselves. I tried to be warm without being intrusive, supportive without being controlling. But I could feel her discomfort around me, the subtle competition, the way she flinched when people praised my achievements. She once joked, half laughing, that it must be hard for any woman to marry a man whose mother was so accomplished. I laughed it off then, but now I saw it clearly for what it was. Slowly, I realized I had been pushed into a smaller and smaller corner of his life, even as my contributions continued to grow. I was good enough to fund, to rescue, to provide, but not good enough to be heard or respected. And that realization forced me to confront something uncomfortable. My love had become a tool, not a bond. And I had allowed it. Around this time, I started therapy for the first time in my life. Not because I thought something was wrong with me, but because I needed a space where I wasn't someone's mother, someone's solution, someone's safety net. I needed to speak as a woman. In those sessions, I said things out loud that I had never admitted before. That sometimes I resented motherhood, that sometimes I wondered who I would have been if I hadn't spent my life proving my worth through sacrifice, that I loved my son deeply, but I didn't like the way he treated me anymore. My therapist didn't villainize him, and she didn't excuse him either. She said something that stuck with me. You taught him how to survive, but you never taught him how to relate to you as an equal adult. That sentence cracked something open. I realized my son still saw me in two extremes, either as the struggling young mother he needed to outgrow, or the wealthy benefactor he could joke about. He had never learned to see me simply as a woman who deserved respect. I decided I needed to talk to him, really talk. Not accuse, not beg, but speak honestly. I invited him to lunch, just the two of us. He showed up late, distracted, checking his phone. When I told him how the toast had made me feel, how humiliating it was, how hurtful, he sighed and said I was making too big a deal out of nothing. He said everyone knew he was joking. He said I should be proud that he was comfortable enough to joke with me like that. He never apologized. That moment changed everything, because for the first time, I wasn't angry. I was clear. I saw him exactly as he was, not as the little boy I remembered or the man I hoped he'd become, but as the man standing in front of me. And I understood something painful but freeing. Love does not obligate me to accept disrespect. I left that lunch knowing I had a decision to make, not just about him, but about myself. And this is where things started to move quietly, deliberately. I reviewed every financial tie between us, every investment, every shared asset, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. I asked myself hard questions. Was I helping him grow, or was I enabling him to stay entitled? Was my generosity an expression of love, or a way to avoid conflict? I didn't announce any changes. I didn't threaten or warn him. I simply began stepping back. I declined to fund a new business idea. I stopped offering unsolicited help. I focused on my own life, my own friendships, my own interests. And you know what surprised me the most? How quickly he noticed when the support stopped flowing. Suddenly, he was calling again. Suddenly, he wanted to clear the air. Suddenly, my feelings mattered, at least enough to discuss. But by then, I had reached a point of no return internally. Because once you see that your value to someone is conditional, you can't unsee it. And as a woman who had fought too hard to be reduced to a wallet with a smile, I knew something bigger was coming. Something that would force him to confront the consequences of how he treated me, not through shouting or drama, but through reality. And before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you what choice I made that changed our relationship forever, I want you to pause for a second and really think about this. If you were in my place, if you were a woman who gave everything to raise a child alone, built a life from nothing, and then watched that child publicly mock your love, What would you have done next? Would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Or would you have finally chosen yourself? Because the decision I made after this moment still divides people to this day, and we're only halfway through what happened. I want to be very clear about what happened next, because this is where people usually stop listening and start judging. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to punish my son. I didn't feel rage or a desire for revenge. What I felt was something much quieter and much more dangerous to our old dynamic: clarity. Kind of clarity that comes when a woman finally understands that love without boundaries is just slow self-erasure. After that lunch, I went home and sat alone in my living room for hours. No TV, no phone, no distractions. I thought about the girl I used to be before motherhood swallowed my entire identity. I thought about the nights I cried silently so my son wouldn't hear. I thought about every time I chose him over myself, and how I never once asked him to choose me in return. And then I asked myself the hardest question of all. If this were anyone else in my life, would I accept this treatment? And the honest answer was no, not from a partner, not from a friend, not from a colleague. So why was motherhood the only relationship where I was expected to accept humiliation as love? That's when I made my decision, quietly, legally, carefully. The SUV was still registered in my name. I had planned to transfer it fully after the birthday weekend, but after everything that happened, I hadn't done it yet. At the time, it felt insignificant. Now, it felt symbolic. I spoke to my attorney not to ask how to hurt my son, but to understand my rights and responsibilities. I didn't want drama. I wanted dignity. A few days later, I asked my son to come over, not to talk, not to argue, just to pick something up. When he arrived, confident and relaxed, I handed him an envelope. Inside was a letter. Not long, not emotional, just honest. I told him that I loved him deeply, that I was proud of him, but that I would no longer tolerate being mocked, minimized, or dismissed. I told him that my support had always come from love, not obligation, and that going forward, our relationship would need to be based on mutual respect, not money. Then I told him about the car. I said I was taking it back. The silence that followed was heavy. He laughed at first, the same laugh from the party, like I had just told another joke. When he realized I wasn't smiling, his expression changed. Confusion turned into disbelief, then into anger. He asked how I could embarrass him like that. The irony almost took my breath away. He said the car was already his, that people knew about it, that this would make him look bad. Not once did he ask how I felt. Not once did he apologize. That's when something in me hardened, not in a cruel way, but in a resolved way. I told him calmly that if his image mattered more than his mother's dignity, then this lesson was long overdue. I reminded him that I raised him to stand on his own, and now I was finally giving him the opportunity to prove he could. He accused me of being manipulative. He accused me of using money to control him, and for the first time I didn't argue back, because deep down I knew the truth scared him more than any accusation. Without my support, he would have to face himself. He left angry, very angry. His wife sent me a message later that night, long and cold, about how disappointed they were in me, how hurtful my actions were, how I was damaging the family. I read it once and didn't respond, because I finally understood that explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you is a losing game. The next few months were quiet, painfully quiet. My son stopped calling altogether. Mutual acquaintances treated me differently, like I had committed some unspoken crime by not playing my role properly. A few even hinted that I should apologize for the sake of peace. And I won't lie, there were nights I cried myself to sleep, questioning everything. Because choosing yourself as a woman, especially as a mother, comes with a kind of loneliness that people don't talk about. But something else happened too. I slept better. I laughed more. I reconnected with parts of myself I had abandoned. I traveled. I made friends who knew me not as someone's mom, but as me. And slowly, I began to feel whole in a way I never had before. About 6 months later, my son reached out, not with anger this time, but exhaustion. His business was struggling. His marriage was strained. The safety net he had taken for granted was gone, and life felt heavier without it. He asked to meet. I agreed, but on my terms. When we sat down, he looked older somehow, quieter. He didn't apologize right away. Instead, he talked about pressure, expectations, fear. And for the first time, I heard vulnerability instead of arrogance. Eventually, he admitted that he never realized how much I had done for him until it stopped. He said he thought my strength meant I didn't need appreciation. That sentence broke my heart all over again, but it also opened a door. I told him something I had never said before. That strength doesn't cancel out pain. That independence doesn't mean invincibility. That I didn't need his praise, but I needed his respect. And I told him that whether or not we rebuilt our relationship depended on his actions, not his words. We're not where we used to be, and honestly, I don't want to go back to the old version of us. We're building something new, slower, more honest, with boundaries on both sides. The car, I sold it, not out of spite, but to close that chapter completely. The money went into a foundation that supports single mothers starting businesses, women who remind me of who I once was. So here's my final thought, and this is for every woman listening to this who has ever been told to be quiet, to be grateful, to be forgiving at the expense of her own dignity. Love does not require self-destruction. Motherhood does not mean martyrdom, and choosing yourself does not make you heartless. It makes you whole. If you were on my side in this story, like this video, if you believe women deserve respect no matter who they are to you, subscribe for more stories like this. And I want to hear from you. Tell me your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments below. I'll see you all in the next story. Even after everything I just told you, the story didn't actually end there, because real life never wraps itself up neatly the way people expect. Healing isn't a straight line, and rebuilding something broken between a mother and a grown son is messier than any dramatic confrontation. What happened next unfolded slowly, in small moments that didn't look like redemption from the outside, but felt monumental to me. After that second meeting with my son, the one where he finally looked tired instead of arrogant, we didn't suddenly become close again. There were no weekly dinners, no long phone calls, no emotional hugs. What we had instead was space. Real space, and for the first time in my life, that space didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like breathing. I didn't rush to check in on him. I didn't ask about his finances or his marriage. I didn't offer solutions. I let silence exist without trying to fix it, and that was harder than any night shift or financial struggle I had ever survived. At first, I worried that stepping back had made me cold, that I had crossed some invisible line where a mother becomes selfish. That guilt crept in during quiet mornings when I remembered him as a little boy, sitting at the kitchen table with cereal spilled everywhere, asking me questions about the world like I had all the answers, but then I reminded myself that loving a child doesn't mean freezing time. It means allowing both of you to grow, even if that growth hurts. A few months later, something small but significant happened. My son called me, not because he needed money, not because something was wrong, but just to tell me he had cooked a meal himself and it actually turned out good. It sounds ridiculous, but I almost cried when I hung up. Not because of the call itself, but because it was the first time he had shared something without expecting anything in return. It felt human, equal. Our conversation slowly changed. He started asking questions instead of making statements. He listened more. Sometimes he caught himself mid-sentence, about to dismiss something I said, and stopped. Those pauses mattered more to me than apologies. They showed awareness, they showed effort, and effort is something I understand deeply, because I built my entire life on it. His wife, on the other hand, kept her distance. I could tell she wasn't comfortable with the shift in power, with the fact that I was no longer playing the role of the endlessly giving, quietly grateful mother. And for once, I didn't chase her approval. I didn't try to smooth things over. I let her feel however she wanted to feel, because I had finally learned that not every relationship is meant to be repaired by me. There were moments when my son slipped back into old habits, moments when he joked a little too sharply or dismissed something I cared about. But the difference now was that I didn't swallow it. I addressed it calmly, immediately, without drama. And every time I did, I watched him recalibrate, not perfectly, not instantly, but genuinely. That's when I realized something important. Boundaries don't push people away if they truly care. They teach people how to stay. I also started noticing changes in myself that had nothing to do with him. I took risks I would have never taken before. I spoke my mind in rooms where I used to stay quiet. I stopped explaining my choices to people who weren't living my life. The woman I was becoming felt unfamiliar, but in a good way, like meeting an old friend I had lost touch with decades ago. One evening, about a year after the birthday incident, my son invited me to dinner at his home, not a restaurant, not a public space, his home. When I arrived, he greeted me at the door, nervous like a teenager. He had set the table himself. No show, no audience, just us. Halfway through the meal, he raised his glass again. My body tensed automatically, the memory still sharp. But this time, his voice was steady. He said, "I want to thank my mother for teaching me what strength actually looks like. Not money, not success, but self-respect." There was no laughter after that, just silence, and then he added quietly, "I'm sorry it took me 40 years to understand it. I didn't cry. I didn't forgive everything in that moment. I didn't pretend the past didn't exist. I simply nodded and said thank you." Because healing doesn't always need grand emotional displays. Sometimes it just needs acknowledgement. Our relationship now is different. It's not built on sacrifice alone. It's built on choice. He chooses to respect me. I choose to be present. And that choice feels more powerful than any gift I could have bought him. So if there's one thing I want every woman listening to this to take away, it's this: you are allowed to evolve, even if it makes people uncomfortable. You are allowed to change the rules of how you're treated, even late in life. And you are absolutely allowed to stop pouring from an empty cup, no matter who's holding it. If this story made you think, if it made you uncomfortable, if it made you feel seen, then like this video. Subscribe for more real stories about messy families, hard choices, and women who refuse to disappear quietly. And tell me in the comments, would you have done the same thing I did, or would you have handled it differently? I'll see you in the next story. Even now, when I think everything has settled, life finds a way to test the lessons I thought I had already learned. Growth has a strange sense of humor like that. Just when you believe you've mastered boundaries, it asks you to defend them again, but this time without anger, without fear, and without slipping back into old habits. About 6 months after that dinner at my son's house, the one where he finally acknowledged my strength, he came to me with a request. Not a demand, not an expectation, a request, and I knew instantly that how I handled this moment would matter more than anything I had done before. He told me he was thinking about expanding his business again, cautiously this time, and that an investor had backed out at the last minute. He didn't ask for money directly. He just said he wanted my advice, only my advice. I remember sitting there, listening to him speak, and feeling two versions of myself pulling in opposite directions. One was the old me, the mother who rushed in with solutions, who equated love with fixing, who felt useful only when she was needed. The other was the woman I had fought to become, the one who knew that support didn't have to come with sacrifice attached. I took a deep breath and chose the second version. I told him what I honestly thought. I told him where I saw risks, where I saw potential, and where I believed he was still driven more by ego than sustainability. I didn't soften it. I didn't wrap it in reassurance. And when I was done, I stopped talking. I didn't offer to invest. I didn't hint that I could help financially. I just sat there. He looked at me for a long moment and then said something I never expected to hear. He said, "Thank you for not saving me." That's when I knew the cycle had truly broken, because a son who understands that being saved is not the same as being supported has finally grown into a man. That moment healed something in me I didn't even realize was still wounded. For so long, my identity had been wrapped around being indispensable. Being needed had felt like proof of love. Letting go of that illusion was terrifying, but it was also freeing in a way I can't fully explain. I was no longer his safety net. I was his mother, yes, but also a separate, complete human being. Not everyone in our family approved of this change. Some relatives whispered that I had become distant. Others said success had made me cold. A few even suggested that I was punishing my son for his honesty. What they didn't understand was that this was the first time honesty had ever truly existed between us. The old version of our relationship was built on unspoken expectations and silent resentment. This new one, while quieter, was real. There were days I still missed the closeness we once had, or at least the illusion of it. There were moments when I questioned whether all of this was worth the pain it caused. But then I would remember the woman I used to be, exhausted, invisible, endlessly giving, and I knew I could never go back to that version of myself without losing everything I had fought for. One afternoon, while volunteering at the foundation I had started with the money from the SUV, I met a young woman who reminded me so much of myself that it almost hurt. She was a single mother, brilliant, driven, and terrified. She told me she felt guilty every time she invested in her business instead of spending that money on her child. I looked her in the eyes and told her something I wish someone had told me decades ago. Your child doesn't need you to disappear for them. They need you to exist fully. That's when it really hit me. This story was never just about my son. It was about generations of women being taught that love means self-erasure, that motherhood requires silence, that strength should be quiet and endless. I had lived that lie for most of my life, and breaking free from it didn't just change my relationship with my son. It changed how I saw myself as a woman. My son and I still have disagreements. We still trigger each other sometimes. But now, when that happens, we talk. We pause, we listen, and if things get tense, we take space without turning it into punishment. That alone feels like a miracle compared to where we started. So when people ask me now if I regret taking the car back, if I regret standing my ground, if I regret choosing myself so late in life, my answer is simple. No, because that decision didn't cost me my son. It gave me a chance to know him as an adult, and it gave him a chance to know me as a woman, not just a mother. And if you're still listening to this, especially if you're a woman who has spent her life being everything to everyone else, I want you to hear this clearly. It is never too late to demand respect. It is never too late to change the rules. And it is never too late to choose yourself without apology. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something uncomfortable or familiar inside you, like this video, subscribe for more real, raw stories about family, boundaries, and the courage it takes to grow. And please, share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've ever had to draw a line with someone you love. I'll see you all in the next story.